Hello everybody and welcome to this presentation entitled How to Spot If You're a Richard. Now, just some context before I start this presentation. If your name is Richard or if you associate with the name Richard, then this presentation is not about you. Unless you behave like a Dick Cheney, ladies and gentlemen, unless you behave like a Richard. You decide that everything is about you and you don't want to be part of the team, in which case you'd be a Dick Cheney, ladies and gentlemen. Being a Richard is something that affects all of us, regardless of country, culture, or gender. And it's something that we need to be aware of so that we can spot when we're being one. When you're being a Richard, you run the risk of undermining what the team is trying to achieve. Marcus Buckingham and Kurt Kaufman, in their book First Break All the Rules, found that self-aware individuals were the building blocks of great teams. So in order to avoid becoming a brilliant jerk that holds everybody's back, I'm going to share with you 4 ways to spot if you're a Richard and 4 things for you to think about to make sure that you can stop it happening. Before I start, just a little bit about me. That's me. On the left, as an 11-year-old, I left school with 3 qualifications and I worked as a permanent employee for 30 years. And if I'm honest, I've had a few moments where I was a Richard myself, and it always helps to get a bit of a reminder from those above us when you're being like that. I've been working for myself for the last 5 years and I help individuals and organizations around the world to build psychologically safe cultures where people know how to spot when they're being a Richard. These vibrant cultures go on to do great things when everyone understands their role within it. I've written 4 books in the last 4 years, including last year's 2 Amazon bestsellers, The Project Book, The Complete Guide to Consistently Delivering Great Projects, and Culture Fix, How to Create a Great Place to Work. The reason that I wrote the books is that I never felt there was a book out there that actually detailed the steps that I could take in order to build great teams or deliver great projects. It's something that I did throughout my 30 years, but there was never a how-to guide to do it. And so in the absence of those how-to guides, I figured I would write it. I know a few things and I thought that I would share those with the world. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn or follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or if you'd like to know more about the work that I do, all of the links are there for you to go and have a look at. Just one other thing that I'd like to mention is that you could join hundreds of people from around the world on the Culture Fix community. This is a group of people dedicated to helping each other to build great team cultures by sharing what they've done that works, what they've done that hasn't, as well as content that inspires them. It's also the place you can find my online programs on emotional intelligence, project management, and culture change, all to help you become the best version of yourself. Find out more at www.notarrichard.com. Okay, so what are those 4 signs when you're being a Richard? The first one is that you're prone to emotional outbursts. In order to manage these, you need to be emotionally intelligent. And for many years now, we've downplayed the role of emotional intelligence in the workplace. We call it soft skills, fluffy stuff. For those of you who've ever had to change a behavior, for those of you who've ever had to change a habit, you know that these are the hardest things to do. Emotional intelligence is the capacity to be aware of, manage and control one's emotions whilst building relationships empathetically and judiciously. These skills used to be a nice to have. These skills were on the periphery of the technical skills. They always played second fiddle, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. But fundamentally what we're talking about is you understanding who you are and what you're about, in order that you can build relationships with other people. And empathy is something that is a skill now that everybody needs. Everybody needs. And in order to be empathetic, so in order to be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you need to understand yourself first. Now, for those of you who've done any kind of personality profiling, you'll recognize this diagram. Most personality surveys are based on Carl Jung's work on his theory of personality in the 90s, 20s, and 30s. And what you've got when you look at this diagram is thinking people at the top, feeling people at the bottom, introverts to the left as you look at it, and extroverts to the right. Now, the thing to make clear before I talk about this in a little bit more detail is that nobody can put you in a circle. You're not just one of these things and no others. Like extroverts are like, oh my gosh, I'm so yellow. Yeah, and maybe that you are. Maybe that you're predominantly yellow or predominantly social, but you have bits of all of these in your personality. The thing that Jung found was that your personality is hardwired generally from birth. So it's part of your DNA. Now, up till the age of our mid-20s, kind of only 90% to 95% of the brain is formed. So there's still a little bit that's malleable, but your kind of personality is kind of cast in stone pretty much when you're born. There was some research done recently that found that you can tell whether a baby is an introvert or an extrovert in hospital. A baby, just by clapping loudly. Extroverted babies will kind of turn to see where the noise comes from. Introverted babies will cry. So it's hardwired, but it changes over time if you want to develop it. So if you're more of a detail person, you like facts, you like figures, you like numbers, you like method, you like process, you like things to be short and sharp. You don't like really groups of people. You just prefer to be left on your own to get something done. If you're more of a people person, then you like harmony. You like doing things in larger groups. You say hello, good morning, how are you? You love familiarity, you love sticking to the rules. You're fiercely loyal and you want to understand the value of something before you actually go into it. Now, if you're an action person, you're just the kind of person that wants to get stuff done. You like forward momentum, you like to keep things moving, you like authority. You like to act and think, you like to challenge the status quo, and you like to take calculated risks. Where if you're more of a social person, then you like agility, you like flexibility, you like large groups of people. In fact, you get energy from large groups. You like presenting in front of a room, you're highly creative, and you always seem to have a set of whiteboard markers in your back pocket. Now remember, as I mentioned at the start of this slide, you're not a pure one of these things. You're a mix of all of those. But in order to make sure that you're not a Richard, you have to understand your personality and also how to manage the different modes and the different behaviors that come with that personality. So for example, if you're more of a detail person, then you get frustrated by loud people like me who like to think out loud. Who like to deviate from the rules, or else you dislike people who swear a lot, which is very much in the action space, who are late for meetings because you're fiercely punctual. So you have to understand who you are and what you're about to then be able to better understand somebody else. And of course, we're not taught these skills in school. These are things that we have to pick up along the way. These are things that we recognize in other people. And so it's really up to us. And often when I teach personality, which is quite different from the way that everybody else teaches it, because I want you to understand that in any kind of scenario, in order for you to be the best version of you, what we need you to think about is the way that you communicate with other people. You ever had someone who communicates to you in the way that they want to do it, not the way that you want to hear it? Your immediate thought is, what a Richard. Right? What a Richard. They're not thinking about me, they're thinking about themselves. They're stood there being energetic, passionate, and flapping their arms about. And they're not thinking about the way that I like to receive information, which is really nice and calm and quiet. That's how I like to receive my information. So you being the best version of you is about you understanding your own personality, but it's also about managing your emotion as well. Now, everything that you see on the left here under emotional baggage, it's a very old-fashioned way of working. And when I started work in the mid-80s, it was all about command and control, and there are still some organization cultures who are stuck in the mid-80s who insist on, you must follow a process at all costs, otherwise everything will break and nothing will happen. And we know that's not the case. We know that we need good humans who know how to communicate and work together. We know that ego is not a good trait to have. We know that gossip is a cancer in most cultures. We know that blame is inherently wrong, but we also recognize that every now and again we, kind of feel that emotion about anger. What we don't want to do is let that out in the office. What we don't want to do is let go of that. What we want to do is to think about the way that we feel. Firstly, to recognize the way that we feel, and then turn that into something that we can use, turn that into something positive that we can express to others. Love, of course, and emotional capital is about loving your job. There's nothing more infectious. And we want to move, kind of from a culture where trust is built to one where trust is assumed. Now, you can move to those kind of cultures when everyone's being the best version of themselves. As soon as you have some people who are acting like Richards in the team, it undermines that team safety. So for that first one, the one thing to think about for the first way of spotting if you're a Richard is for you to learn about your personality and also to learn about your emotional triggers and find ways to control them. The second sign, spot if you're Richard, is when you don't have anything to stand for, or you don't understand what it is that you stand for and why. We call these values, and they're super critically important because they provide us with emotional direction. So there's that link to that first sign that you might be in a bit of a Richard. These are the things that you live out in the open on a day-to-day basis, and I often say that values aren't laminated, they're lived. I often see organizations, the senior management team come together, they create a set of values, they laminate them around the office and they expect people to live them. That's not the way values work. We all have our own values, we all bring those to the office, and it's up to us as a team to agree what those things should be. Your personal values guide your interactions with your teammates, with your customers, towards what the organization is trying to achieve, of course. And ultimately, your attitude, your mindset is made up of a sum or a collection of your attitudes. So if you don't know what you stand for, it's really hard to get your attitude right. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this towards the end of the presentation. You don't know what it is to stand behind, and then consequently you make bad decisions, or you make decisions that you're upset about at a later date because you don't really understand what it is that you stand for. Your values really define whether you're someone worth following or not. And they often really play into your behaviors. What we're looking for within great workplace cultures that are psychologically safe is people that we can follow, people who we can say, oh, they're really trying their best to be a really good human being. Plus, they're smashing their work out, they're getting it done. Your values really drive this. And your values change all of the time. I have two children. They're aged 13 and 12, and they're a big part of who I am. They're a big part of what I stand for, and a big part for what I hold dear. And so, my values prior to having children were different, because obviously I was a little bit more of a selfish individual because I didn't have as many people to care for. They change, so I have this real strong family value now that I have a family. And similarly, when you work with a team of people whose value you have shared values, it's important then you agree the behaviors that you'll display towards each other. Because what you want to do is to grow as a team. You want to take on board new ideas. You want to drive forwards. You don't want to take unnecessary risks, but you still need to be able to take risks. And it's your values that really define how you respond here, which is how we continually grow to meet the challenges of today, not yesterday. Some people, unfortunately, their values never change. Their attitudes never change. And consequently, they get left behind. Now, great workplace cultures, they rely on highly emotionally intelligent human beings, on the far right there, high EQ, who really care and understand about their job, the people around them, the organization and what it's trying to achieve. And that's what we mean by engagement. When you really care, you are highly engaged, when you really, really care. Where you've got people whose values aren't aligned to those of either the team or the organization, they tend to behave in a low emotionally intelligent way. And everything to the left of the line here, we call toxic cultures. Stagnant cultures are really quiet. There's not a lot going on there. We kind of let people get away with poor behaviors, and that definitely happens in combatant. Is people are quite vocal. That's quite a lot of bullying in combatant cultures. Is people really behaving in a way that is at odds with the way the rest of the organization wants to work. What we want to make sure is that you're the best version of yourself. You understand your values such that you're able to respectfully challenge, because all great teams need a little bit of healthy friction. Now, healthy friction very much sits in the vibrant quadrant there, the top right, and the top right is where you want to be. Not every team can be there all of the time, because the nature of culture is you move through these quadrants. But if you've taken the time to define what vibrant looks like, and if you played your own personal values into that, then you know what you're aiming for. Now, a lot of the work that I do with organizations is to define what vibrant looks like. Most organizations don't do this, most teams don't do this, and so they only ever get to vibrant either accidentally or when you have a crisis. And when we have a crisis, we all pull together. We all want to be the best human beings. Not only that, we're all really, really engaged with what the organization is trying to achieve, and we get this vibrancy. Often when the crisis passes, we fall back and we're back into stagnant, or we're back into combatant, and we say things like, oh, if only we could have stayed in vibrant. Of course you can. It's about you understanding what your values are. It's about you understanding how to be the best of you. It's about you understanding how to manage and control those emotions that you feel, and then bring those into the team where you can all agree what you as a team stand for and how you're going to contribute to the success of the organization. So your one thing to think about for this particular point is about you taking some time to understand what it is that you stand for. What do you hold dear, and how can you contribute to team and organization success? The third way to spot if you're in a Richard is when you're a Debbie Downer. Now, a little bit of context here. Debbie Downer, the character Debbie Downer first appeared on the American comedy show Saturday Night Live back in 2004 and was created and portrayed by the fantastic Rachel Dratch, who you see on screen there. In the show, the character would either spend her time finding ways for people to feel bad, or else she'd find ways to really bring a group down with negative comments. She would always see the dark side and the black side of things. I strongly urge you to head over to YouTube and search Debbie Downer just to see some real classic sketches from some really famous and well-known comedians now who weren't that well known back in 2004. Now, of course, no one wants to be the most negative member of the team, and no amount of extroverts telling you to be positive can ever make you be positive. I think often there's this real confusion when it comes to positivity, is if we tell people to be positive enough times, that will help them to be positive. And of course, that's not true. Of course it's not. It's just like when my son says he's feeling sick and he doesn't want to go to school, I tell him he's fine. His immediate response is, no, I'm not. And I find myself in this circular loop that I just can't get out of. It's really about helping people. It's about coaching people, but it's also about you not being a Richard. It's about you being focused on solutions. It's about you recognizing that not everything is black and bad and broken. It's about you saying to yourself, oh, what are some options that we have here? Now, everyone at every stage has faced impossible deadlines, roadblocks, or just simply having a bad day. Your attitude, of course, is entirely up to you and how you approach things. Your attitude is how you show up, it's what decisions you make, it's how you make them, it's how you think about yourself, it's how you think about others. And it's how determined you are to take responsibility and action. You, nobody else, you get to make the decision about your attitude every single day when you wake up. Now, when you have the right attitude, it helps you to be less Richard-like. You're more emotional intelligent. You're better able to build, maintain relationships. You're focused on solutions, not problems. Your language is different. You're not talking about how things are bad and broken. You're talking in terms of opportunity. The more positive your attitude, the better your mindset, and the better you're able to contribute to the group's mindset. Because if the group's mindset is good, then you have a vibrant culture that believes that anything is possible. And this is where you become a role model for other people. You're able to help, coach, mentor. You're able to ask, are you okay? Is everything all right? You're able to see that someone's got a negative opinion of something and you're going to help them. You're not going to tell them to be positive. And so it's about you finding that inside yourself. And when you're being the best version of you, it's infectious. It really is. You're someone that we want to follow. You're someone that we look up to. You're someone that we can say your attitude's right. You're a model of productivity. And unfortunately, productivity isn't where it used to be. Indeed, Atlassian, American software company Atlassian, found that generally we're only about 60% productive in work, and that we waste a whole heap of time, and we do, whether it's getting distracted by emails, whether it's back-to-back meetings. When did that become a thing? The last thing we did back-to-back as a human race was shoot each other. And yet we find ourselves in these nonsensical situations where we're making absolutely no time whatsoever for our work, and then we're busy. We're busy. And that's become the latest word that everybody uses, right? And predominantly it's an excuse. It's an excuse for them not making the tough decisions about them being productive. And it's you. This is where you lapse into being a Richard, is you don't return emails, you don't return phone calls, and you're constantly telling other people just how busy you are. Guess what? Everybody is busy, but there's a difference between busy and productive. Productive, we're really focused. We're really determined to get through the work. We want to keep our promises. We want to be a good human being that displays empathy. We want to help, support. We want to come up with solutions to problems. What we don't want to do is add to those problems with our bad attitude and our negativity. So remember, it only takes one bad apple to spoil a fruit bowl, and we don't want you to be that negative influence on everybody else. Now, I get that everybody has a bad day. It's impossible to be the best human being every single day of the week. It's impossible. It just is. It's impossible. What we're shooting for is 4 really good productive days a week, or if you're part-time, pro-rata it. You do the math. But what we want to do is to be that positive influence. We need to make sure that we take breaks. We need to make sure that we refresh. We need to make sure that not only are we focused on doing productive work, but we also make time to be able to help other people as well. So you need to really ensure that you keep your Debbie Downer at bay and focus on what's achievable rather than what's not. So your one thing to think about here is all about your attitude. This is your choice when you get up in the morning. Your attitude is your choice on a daily basis, and you want to be the best human that you can be, that's focused on possibility, that's focused on opportunity. Okay. The last way for you to spot if you're being a Richard is when you think that you're the smartest person in the room. You can't believe you're working with a team of idiots that don't know how to get things done in the way that you do. And if only everyone was like you, then the world would be a better place. In the trade, we call this arrogance, and it's never a good thing. No matter how, kind of much you try to justify it to yourself, arrogance is not a good thing. Many organizations, of course, still promote people based on the length of tenure and the smarts that they have. And this is where you end up in that cycle where you have a bunch of brilliant jerks infecting your team. And you all know what a brilliant jerk is. You might even be one, in which case this point is specifically for you. A brilliant jerk is someone who's got all of the technical knowledge generally of how to do their job, but none of the emotional skills. Now, Daniel Goleman wrote the book on emotional intelligence, and what he found was that your IQ determines 20% of your future success, with the rest being made up of emotional intelligence, the other 80% being made up of emotional intelligence and other factors. So, it's really, really important here that you understand that when I talk about smart, I'm talking about technical. But if you kind of view your brain as two sides, a right and left, and you have a slider between the right and the left. So the right is the emotional intelligence side. That's where empathy, intuition, creativity, relationship building, communication all live. They all live on the right side. And this side of the brain is important for team events, workshops, conversations, meetings, anything where you have to contribute, anything where you have to be a really good human being. This is where you ensure that teams are inclusive, that there's cognitive diversity, and that everybody listens to everybody else. On the left side, if you'd slide it over there, is the technical stuff. That this is where you learn about the things that you need to be able to do your job effectively. And it doesn't matter whether you're a software developer, it doesn't matter whether you're a project manager, a nurse, a care worker, you work in a cafe. Everyone has this slider where you have to move it across based on the situation that you're in, and you have to decide, do I need to bring more technical knowledge here, or do I have to bring more emotional knowledge? And what we're looking for is a real healthy balance between the two, and it constantly moves throughout the day. Where you get a weighting on one thing and not the other, obviously the other side suffers. So where I see too much emotional intelligence, generally they haven't got the technical smarts, the technical knowledge to be able to do the job in the way that they should. In other words, keep things moving along. Where you've got too much technical knowledge, then you get bogged down in detail, and you never then look up from that, create the connections with humans, work collaboratively to get something done. And in those situations, you convince yourself you've got all of the knowledge. A quick note on cognitive conditions, and this is something that you should Google. It's fascinating. It's something that helps me kind of keep my own biases in check. This one particularly is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you haven't heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, it was Cornell University students, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, found through a series of experiments that unskilled employees weren't as good as they thought they were. Harvard Business Review titled the paper, it was published, and they titled their article, "Those Who Can't Don't Know It," which I really love. Now, if the Dunning-Kruger effect comes as something as a surprise for you, then you might be being a bit of a Richard here, because it could be you. You probably already know. If you already know that, then maybe not so much. The pair proposed, so Dunning-Kruger proposed that incompetent people, that was their words, by the way, not mine, didn't recognize their own lack of skills or the extent of it. You know who these people are. You know who they are. They're able to talk confidently about something, and yet there's absolutely nothing behind it. Hell, we've got some world leaders that are doing this, a very good job at this right now. Worse still, they couldn't recognize the skill that others had either. Of course, to avoid falling into the trap, it's critically important that you continually self-develop, that you don't just assume that the skills that you have now are good enough to kind of safeguard your future. It's really important that you think that. Obviously, unless you're in your late 90s, in which case you're probably good. Good for you. You've kept yourself nice and relevant. For everyone else, what's the thing that your personality doesn't do well? Or else, what's the technical skill you need to be able to build to be a better version of you and achieve those goals that you've either set yourself or the organization has? You might have to cut down on the amount of time you spend watching Netflix, for example, but it's worth it to avoid being the Richard who thinks that they're the smartest person in the room. Just interestingly, Dunning-Kruger followed up their initial study with another one, which suggested that with minimal tutoring on the skills that they were previously deficient in, people were better able to understand their skill level. So they were more self-aware on their shortcomings. Not only that, they were able to fill those skills gap relatively quickly. And so I think for you, this is about you understanding your continued relevance in the world. Now, not just technically, but emotionally too. The world is a completely different place than it was 15 years ago. It really, really is. And so you have to grow, you have to evolve. Whenever I'm working with organizations and with certain individuals, they're waiting for people to change, to go back for the ways that things used to work. They're putting the blame on generations. And every generation, which is a massive mistake, right? Because every generation kind of blames the one before it and despairs of the one after it. You know, that's just the way of the world. And you don't want to get into that position. What you want to do is to learn the way that this new generation that's into the workforce, learn the way that they communicate. What are they savvy at? What are their concerns? And you really want to understand the world from their perspective, because that should be your perspective too, because that's the time we live in now. So your one thing to think about for this particular Richard is about you learning something new every week, but don't be a content vacuum, right? So read a blog, read a business book, listen to a podcast, watch a TED talk, do something like that. But I strongly urge you to take notes when you do that. Pick out one or two things that you can do differently and then work hard to do that. Don't just read and read and read and listen and listen and listen and listen without letting it motivate, without letting it inspire you, without it changing the way that you act or the way that you think, without it changing your way that you view the world. So, giving you four ways to spot if you're being a Richard. Those 4 ways to spot if you're being a Richard. You're prone to emotional outbursts. So the way to manage that is to learn about your personality and your emotional triggers. The second way to spot if you're being a Richard is when you stand for nothing. So your one thing to think about here is about taking time to understand what it is that you stand for, and also how you can contribute to building a vibrant team culture that's psychologically safe and super productive. The third way to spot if you're being a Richard is if you're a bit of a Debbie Downer. And so your one thing to think about here is to check your attitude and your mindset on a daily basis. Make sure you're showing up. Make sure that you're putting a shift in. And then the last way to spot if you're being Richard is when you think you're the smartest person in the room. So this is about you learning something new every week, but not becoming a content vacuum. So when you take the time to think about all of those things and those opportunities for you to be a Richard, what's the thing that you're going to do first? Don't try and do all 4. Massive mistake that we make. That's where we're planning to fail. So which one of those 4 will you address first? Now, as I mentioned, what I want to do is quickly mention before I finish here, we have hundreds of people from around the globe who are sharing their ideas. Now, you can join for free. You don't have to pay the $75 for the online programs. You can join for free. It's a psychologically safe space, free of noise, where you can share ideas and check in on what other people are doing in order to be the best versions of themselves. And what a great world we would live in if nobody was a Richard. Thank you very much.